Three children smile in a 1901 photo. When zoomed in, historians are horrified. The innocent faces captured in sepia tones hide a disturbing secret that remained undiscovered for over a century. What appears to be a charming family portrait reveals something sinister when modern technology exposes what the naked eye cannot see. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The winter sun barely penetrated the frost-etched windows of Margaret Walsh's home office as she settled into her morning routine. At 67, the retired historian had dedicated her post-career years to digitizing forgotten archives from Chicago's past. This December morning in 2001, exactly 100 years after the photograph was taken, she expected nothing extraordinary from the sepia-toned image from St. Mary's Home for Children. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and clicked through the scanning software, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The photograph showed three children, identified on the back as Thomas Hartwell, Elizabeth Hartwell, and William Hartwell, posed formally against a plain backdrop. Their clothes were neat but simple, typical of orphans from respectable institutions at the turn of the century. "Poor little things," she murmured, zooming in to check the image quality. That's when she saw them, faint, dark lines encircling each child's neck, nearly invisible against the aged photograph's mottled surface. Margaret's hand froze on the mouse. These weren't imperfections in the paper or quirks of old photography. The marks were too uniform, too deliberately placed just beneath the high collars of their Sunday best. She leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching. Thomas, the oldest, at perhaps 9, stood with his hand on little Elizabeth's shoulder, while William, barely 5, sat on a wooden chair. All three smiled with an unnatural stillness, their eyes vacant despite the upturned lips. "This isn't right," Margaret whispered, her voice sounding strange in the empty room. The historian in her immediately catalogued possibilities, perhaps marks from the photographic process, or shadows from clothing. But the former detective's wife in her, who had listened to James Morrison's case stories for 30 years, recognized something else entirely. Margaret's pulse quickened as she enhanced the image further. The lines remained, becoming more distinct, thin, precise circles that no child would naturally bear. Her hands began to tremble, and she felt the air grow thick around her, as if the century-old photograph had released something unseen into her quiet home. She'd spent decades handling historical artifacts, reading accounts of Chicago's darkest chapters, yet nothing had ever made her feel this immediate sense of witnessing something profoundly wrong. These weren't just orphans posing for a commemorative portrait. The Hartwell siblings' serene smiles now seemed like masks hiding something unspeakable. Margaret pushed back from her desk, suddenly needing space from the children's empty eyes. Whatever had happened at St. Mary's Home in 1901 had been carefully concealed, but not completely, not from someone who knew where to look. With trembling fingers, Margaret Walsh turned the photograph over, her breath catching as she read the neat inscription on the back. Thomas, Elizabeth and William Hartwell, December 1901, St. Mary's Home for Children. Something about it felt staged, the handwriting too deliberate, the script too careful, the date recorded with suspicious precision. In her 40 years as a historian, she'd developed an instinct for authenticity, and this felt rehearsed, as if crafted to project normalcy. "This is too perfect," she whispered to herself, running her fingertip over the inscription. The penmanship was immaculate, lacking the natural inconsistencies of hurried documentation. Even the paper quality seemed unusual for orphanage records of that era. Margaret's mind drifted to research she'd conducted years earlier on Catholic institutions in Chicago. She'd read through yellowed memoirs written by Irish nuns who had described St. Mary's as a sanctuary, a haven for lost children abandoned in the wake of immigration waves and economic hardship. The orphanage had been praised for its compassion, its cleanliness, its moral guidance, all under the watchful eye of Sister Catherine McMahon. The retired historian reached for her notebook, flipping through pages of meticulous notes until she found what she was looking for. December 1901, she murmured. The same month, Sister Catherine received commendation from the diocese for her exceptional service to the children. The coincidence now struck her as suspicious rather than serendipitous. She pulled out her magnifying glass, examining the photograph more closely. The children's clothing, too pristine for orphans, their posture, too rigid, as if positioned by unseen hands, their smiles identical in their restraint. "It's as if history itself is trying to mislead me," Margaret said to the empty room of her small apartment. She'd spent decades trusting documents, believing in the sanctity of historical records. Now, holding this single photograph, doubt crept in like a winter draft. She carefully placed the photograph in an acid-free sleeve and reached for her telephone. James Morrison would want to see this. His background in detective work had given him an eye for inconsistencies that even her trained historian's perspective might miss. "James," she said when he answered, "I need your opinion on something. It's about St. Mary's and those marks on the children's necks. I think we're looking at something deliberately obscured. The narrative feels constructed." As Margaret hung up, she glanced once more at the photograph. The smiling faces of Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Hartwell seemed to watch her, their expressions frozen in time, waiting for someone to finally see what had been hidden in plain sight for over a century. Margaret's curiosity morphed into obsession as the days passed. She spent countless hours hunched over her computer, enlarging different sections of the photograph until the pixels blurred. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she noticed something in the background, a plaque mounted on the studio wall behind the Hartwell children. "How did I miss this?" she whispered, adjusting her glasses. The plaque was partially obscured, but visible enough to reveal unusual symbols etched into its surface. They weren't standard Christian iconography, despite being from St. Mary's Home for Children. These symbols seemed older, more arcane, circles intersecting with triangles and what appeared to be stylized hands reaching downward towards smaller figures. Margaret searched through reference books on religious symbolism, but found nothing matching the peculiar designs. They reminded her vaguely of medieval control symbols, marks once used to denote ownership or subjugation, not protection or blessing as one might expect in a children's home. The historian recalled articles she'd read about Sister Catherine McMahon years ago. The nun had been praised in community records for her firm but loving guidance of the orphans. Local newspapers from the early 20th century portrayed her as a savior to Chicago's abandoned children, her methods described as innovative and transformative. "Discipline, cloaked in kindness," Margaret murmured, remembering the phrase from an old interview with a former resident. At the time, she'd interpreted it as tough love, necessary structure for children without parents. Now, those words carried a more sinister undertone. She pulled out her notebook, sketching the symbols as accurately as possible. Were these emblems part of some ritual practice? The thought sent a chill through her body. Orphanages of that era, particularly those run by religious orders, often operated with little oversight. Their isolation made them perfect environments for unusual practices to flourish unchecked. Margaret thought about Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Hartwell, their faces forever frozen in that unnatural serenity. What had they endured behind those walls? What system had been implemented to produce such compliant children, standing so perfectly still for a photograph that should have been impossible for young subjects to maintain? The more she studied the image, The more convinced she became that St. Mary's wasn't simply a refuge for lost children. The orphanage's reputation for miracle transformations of troubled youth took on new meaning. Perhaps those transformations weren't miracles at all, but something manufactured through methods hidden behind charitable works and religious authority. "What were you really doing there, Sister Catherine?" Margaret whispered to the empty room, her finger tracing the outline of the plaque on her screen. "And what did these symbols mean to you and those children?" By February 1902, Margaret Walsh could no longer bear the weight of her discovery alone. The photograph of the Hartwell children had consumed her thoughts for weeks, their serene smiles haunting her dreams. During the annual Historical Preservation Conference in downtown Chicago, she spotted James Morrison examining a glass display case, his methodical gaze reminiscent of his former career. "Dr. Morrison," she whispered, approaching him in a quiet corner away from the crowd. "I need your expertise on something disturbing." James turned, his expression softening at the sight of his colleague. The former detective had developed a reputation for discretion and analytical thinking since joining the museum staff 3 years prior. "Of course, Margaret. What's troubling you?" With trembling hands, she produced a manila envelope from her bag and led him to an empty meeting room. The winter light cast long shadows across the polished table as she carefully extracted the photograph. "Look at their necks," she instructed, her voice barely audible. "And here, in the background, this plaque." James leaned forward, his police instincts immediately engaged. He studied the 3 children, Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Hartwell, noting the unnatural stillness in their posture and the faint dark lines beneath their collars. His gaze shifted to the blurry plaque behind them. "These symbols," he murmured, tracing them with his fingertip without touching the photograph. "They're not standard religious iconography from any Catholic institution I've studied." Margaret nodded vigorously. "Exactly. I've researched every conventional symbol used by St. Mary's Home for Children. These are different. They appear ritualistic," James observed, his brow furrowing, "almost like binding symbols. In my police work, I encountered similar markings in cases involving control mechanisms, psychological and otherwise." The curator reached for his reading glasses, examining the plaque more closely. The arrangement suggests a hierarchy, a system, not just decoration. "What kind of orphanage would display such things?" Margaret asked, her academic detachment momentarily giving way to raw emotion. "One that operated beyond conventional oversight," James replied grimly. "These symbols create a visual language, a reminder of authority that children would see daily." The 2 colleagues exchanged knowing glances, the gravity of their suspicions hanging between them. Outside, conference attendees mingled cheerfully, discussing preservation techniques and historical minutiae. "We need more evidence," James said finally, his voice regaining its professional steadiness. "If what we suspect is true about Sister Catherine's establishment, we're looking at something far darker than poor conditions or strict discipline." Margaret nodded, carefully returning the photograph to its envelope. "I was afraid you'd say that. I was also afraid you'd dismiss me entirely." "Some secrets," James replied, "are too important to remain buried, no matter how deeply someone tried to hide them." Margaret's research led her to a battered desk, once owned by Sister Catherine McMahon and now tucked away in the museum's archives. The retired historian had spent weeks tracking down the nun's personal effects, following paper trails that most would have abandoned. Her fingers traced the worn oak surface, feeling the indentations where Sister Catherine had pressed too hard with her pen. As if the wood itself held memories of what had been written upon it. "There has to be more." Margaret whispered to herself, methodically examining each drawer. Years of cataloguing historical artifacts had taught her that people rarely displayed their true selves in plain sight. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, not from age, but by design. Her trained eye caught the subtle difference in the wood grain, revealing a false bottom that had remained undiscovered for decades. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside lay a small leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed and cramped with hurried writing. The historian's heart raced as she carefully opened it, recognizing Sister Catherine's distinctive script from official orphanage records she'd studied earlier. "May God forgive what necessity demands," read the first entry, dated January 1901. "The invisible reins work better than any rod or strap. The children learn quickly that disobedience has consequences that leave no marks for prying eyes." Margaret felt ice spread through her veins. The diary detailed a system of control that went far beyond conventional discipline. Sister Catherine wrote of children who spoke out being fitted with special collars during photograph sessions to ensure their compliance. The nun described these methods as merciful compared to the beatings common in other institutions. One passage particularly stood out. "Thomas Hartwell required extra attention today. His spirit remains unbroken despite our best efforts. Elizabeth and William are more compliant, but their brother's influence concerns me. Dr. Blackwood suggests a more permanent solution if the boy cannot be corrected." The historian closed the diary, her hands shaking. The words suggested more than discipline. They hinted at a system so ingrained that it never needed to be spoken aloud, a silent understanding between the orphanage staff, the church, and perhaps even the authorities. Margaret carefully photographed each page before returning the diary to its hiding place. She couldn't risk removing it yet, not until she understood the full scope of what had happened. The invisible reins, mentioned repeatedly throughout the text, sent chills down her spine, connecting directly to those faint, dark lines she'd spotted on the children's necks in the photograph. This wasn't just about one image anymore. It was about an entire system designed to silence those who had no voice to begin with. April brought a breakthrough when James Morrison called in a photographic expert he'd known from his police detective days, Samuel Carter. A man in his 70s with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that trembled slightly with age, but remained remarkably precise in their work, arrived at the museum carrying a worn leather case of specialized equipment. "I've analyzed thousands of photographs from this era," Samuel explained, as he carefully positioned Margaret's discovery under his magnifying apparatus. The expert's reputation for meticulous analysis of antique images had earned him respect throughout academic circles. And though he rarely took on private consultations anymore, Margaret watched anxiously as Samuel adjusted dials and peered intently at the Hartwell siblings' faces. The museum's archive room fell silent, except for the occasional scratch of his pencil against notepad paper. James stood by the door, arms crossed, his former detective's instincts clearly sensing they were approaching something significant. A long-exposure photography required subjects to remain perfectly still, Samuel finally said, removing his glasses to rub tired eyes. Children were particularly difficult to photograph in those days. Even the most well-behaved child fidgets, breathes visibly, blinks. He gestured for Margaret to look through his specialized lens. Notice the absolute stillness in their posture. The eyes especially, there's no micro-movement, no blur whatsoever. They might have been disciplined children, Margaret offered, though her voice betrayed her doubt. Samuel shook his head. "I've studied Victorian post-mortem photography for decades. The positioning, the unnatural stillness, the peculiar flatness in the eyes. These are hallmarks of photographs taken after death, not discipline." James approached, his curator's curiosity overtaken by his investigative instincts. "But you're certain?" The practice wasn't uncommon, Samuel continued. Families often wanted one final image of deceased loved ones, especially children. But those photographs were private mementos, not institutional records pretending to show living children. He pointed to the faint lines visible beneath their collars. These marks are consistent with what I've seen in other cases. The children appear serene because someone posed them that way. Carter's weathered eyes met Margaret's, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the entire room with its terrible weight. These children weren't just told to sit still, he said. They were already gone before the shutter closed. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as the full implication settled over her. The smiling Hartwell siblings hadn't been captured in a moment of life. They had been arranged in a grotesque theatre of innocence after their deaths. With this grim possibility looming, James Morrison contacted Dr. Anthony Turner, a forensic anthropologist whose reputation for solving historical mysteries preceded him. The curator's police background had taught him when to call in specialists, and this case demanded expertise beyond what the museum could provide. "And I've seen my share of death," James confided as they hunched over the photograph in Anthony's laboratory at the university, "but nothing like this, hidden in plain sight for over a century." Dr. Turner adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the enlarged image. His methodical approach was why he'd become the go-to expert for identifying trauma patterns in historical documentation. The anthropologist's fingers traced the air just above the children's necks. "Never touching the precious original. These marks aren't random," he explained, his voice clinically detached, yet somehow gentle. "See how they maintain consistent pressure points." He pulled up forensic comparison images on his computer. The ligature patterns match what we'd expect to see in cases of strangulation, specifically with a thin cord or wire. Margaret Walsh shuddered visibly. The historian had insisted on being present. Her connection to the Hartwell siblings now too personal to delegate. Could it be a photographic anomaly? Maybe damage to the print? Anthony shook his head. "I've analyzed hundreds of period photographs. These marks are deliberate and consistent across all three children." He pointed to Elizabeth Hartwell's neck. "The indentation here follows the exact anatomical pathway we'd expect. This isn't coincidence." James paced the small laboratory. His former detective instincts fully awakened. "So we're looking at evidence of murder, documented and then displayed as if nothing happened." "Worse," Dr. Turner replied, pulling up additional images Samuel Carter had enhanced. "The positioning suggests they were posed after death. The unnatural stillness," Carter noticed. "It's because no living child could maintain such perfect immobility during long exposure photography." Margaret's eyes welled with tears. "Thomas, Elizabeth and William never had a chance." The anthropologist nodded solemnly. "The precision of these marks indicates someone with knowledge of anatomy, perhaps someone with medical training." "Like Dr. Edmund Blackwood," James suggested, recalling the name from their research. "A doctor without credentials would explain the methodical nature of these deaths," Anthony confirmed, "and the careful staging afterward." As they gathered their evidence, the weight of responsibility settled over them. These weren't just historical curiosities or academic puzzles. They were children whose final moments had been captured and disguised as innocence. "We need to document everything," Margaret insisted, her voice finding strength. "These children deserve more than to be forgotten twice." June arrived with sweltering heat that clung to Chicago like a damp shroud. The 15th anniversary celebration of St. Mary's Home for Children loomed on the horizon, an event that Margaret Walsh couldn't afford to miss. She spent hours crafting her disguise, a modest dress, hair tucked beneath a plain hat, and spectacles that altered the shape of her face just enough to avoid recognition. The evening of the celebration, Margaret slipped through the ornate doors of St. Mary's Chapel among a crowd of benefactors and community members. The air inside was heavy with incense and unspoken history. Candles flickered in brass holders, casting long shadows that danced across the vaulted ceiling like restless spirits. Her pulse quickened when Sister Catherine McMahon entered the chapel. The elderly nun moved with surprising purpose despite her frail frame, her spine straight as a ruler, even as her hands betrayed a persistent tremor. Time had carved deep lines into her face, but her eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as she surveyed the gathered crowd. Margaret pressed herself against a stone pillar, watching as the sister moved methodically from candle to candle. The nun's trembling fingers struggled with each match, yet she refused assistance from younger sisters hovering nearby. Was it pride that kept her performing this ritual alone, or penance? "She's been lighting these anniversary candles for 40 years, whispered a woman beside Margaret. "Never misses one. Even after her stroke last winter." The historian nodded silently, studying Catherine's face in the candlelight. Each flame illuminated something haunted in the old woman's expression, a momentary flicker of what might have been guilt or grief before her features settled back into practiced serenity. Around them, the orphanage gleamed with polish and pride. Framed photographs of smiling children lined the hallway leading to the chapel, carefully curated images of gratitude and salvation. Wealthy patrons nodded approvingly at the displays, while staff guided tours through immaculate dormitories. But Margaret's trained eye caught the discrepancies, the too tight smiles of current residents, the way certain corridors remained closed to visitors, the nervous glances exchanged between staff when questions probed too deeply. The entire celebration felt like an elaborate performance, with Sister Catherine as its aging director. When the nun's gaze swept across the chapel and briefly locked with Margaret's, the historian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Did Catherine recognize her? Or was that flash of alarm merely the startled response of a woman with too many secrets? Margaret lowered her eyes, pretending to pray. The orphanage's carefully constructed facade of warmth and charity seemed to waver in the candlelight, revealing glimpses of something far darker lurking just beneath the surface. The manila envelope arrived at the museum on a stifling July afternoon, addressed simply to Dr. Morrison, curator. No return address, no markings, just James Morrison's name scrawled in shaky handwriting that suggested age or urgency. James opened it in his office, away from curious eyes. Inside, he found yellowed newspaper clippings, their edges crumbling at his touch. The headlines from 1902 Chicago papers told a disturbing story. Seasonal illness, claims 3 at St. Mary's. Children's home, reports, unusual number of collapses. Winter fever strikes orphanages. "Margaret needs to see this," he whispered, carefully arranging the brittle papers on his desk. The former detective in him recognized the pattern immediately. What had been dismissed as coincidental illness a century ago now appeared as something far more sinister, especially when viewed alongside the photographs of smiling children with those telltale marks. Among the clippings lay a smaller envelope containing a photocopy of medical registration records from Illinois State Medical Board, 1895-1905. James's eyes widened as he scanned the document. Dr. Edmund Blackwood. The physician whose signature appeared on dozens of death certificates from St. Mary's was conspicuously absent from the registry. "He wasn't even a doctor," James muttered, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for his phone to call Margaret Walsh. When Margaret arrived an hour later, her face paled as she examined the evidence. "The orphanage's respected physician was a fraud," she said, her voice barely audible. "Who was covering for him? And why?" The curator pulled out a magnifying glass, examining the newspaper photographs more closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a grainy image of a funeral service outside St. Mary's. In the background stood Sister Catherine, her expression unreadable, and beside her, a tall man with a physician's bag, presumably Blackwood. "The chain of trust is breaking," Margaret whispered. "If Blackwood wasn't licensed, who was he? And who allowed him to treat or harm those children?" They spent hours cross-referencing dates. The sudden collapses peaked in the months following the photograph of the Hartwell siblings. Each death certificate bore Blackwood's signature, each cause listed as natural complications or respiratory failure. As dusk fell outside the museum windows, James carefully placed the documents into an acid-free folder. "Whoever sent these knows more," he said. "They're giving us pieces, but not the whole picture." Margaret nodded grimly. "Something monstrous is surfacing, James, and I fear we've only scratched the surface." During a sweltering August, the museum's attic became an oven of dust and forgotten history. A young intern named Rebecca, assigned to catalogue overflow artifacts, wiped sweat from her brow as she shifted boxes in the stifling heat. Her hand brushed against something tucked behind a shelf, a metal box. Its lock green with age. When Margaret Walsh received Rebecca's call, she abandoned her lunch and rushed across town. James Morrison met her at the museum steps, his former detective instincts already on high alert. Together, they watched as the maintenance supervisor worked the ancient lock with his tools. "It's been here for decades," the supervisor muttered, finally breaking through with a satisfying click. The lid creaked open, revealing dozens of photographs arranged in neat rows. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the first image. A boy with hollow eyes and a forced smile stared back at her, around his neck, just visible beneath his high collar, that same faint, dark line. "My God," James whispered, spreading more photos across the table. "There must be 30 children here." Each photograph followed the same pattern. Children from St. Mary's home, posed formally, smiling with that same unnatural serenity the Hartwell siblings had shown, and each bore those telltale marks around their necks, carefully positioned beneath collars and ribbons. "This wasn't isolated," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "This was systematic." James examined the backs of several photographs, finding dates spanning 15 years. The same photographer each time, someone named Joseph Winters. Margaret recalled the financial records she'd reviewed. Winters was paid handsomely by the orphanage's board of trustees, 4 times the going rate for children's portraits. As they laid out the photographs chronologically, a pattern emerged. Clusters of children photographed after major donations from Chicago's elite families. The wealthy patrons who funded St. Mary's expansions, who attended its charity galas in their finery, who praised Sister Catherine's devotion in newspaper interviews. "They bought silence," James said. Connecting the dates to the donation records, their money purchased shadows where these children should have found safety. Margaret carefully placed the Hartwell siblings' photograph alongside the others. Thomas, Elizabeth, and William were no longer anomalies. They were part of a horrifying collection, their smiles masking the same fate that had befallen so many others. "We need to find every child in these photographs," she said, determination hardening her voice. And we need to find out who Joseph Winters was." The box had transformed their investigation. What began as a disturbing discovery was now an undeniable pattern of institutional horror, preserved in sepia and silver, hidden in plain sight for over a century. As autumn leaves drifted across Chicago, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Margaret Walsh received a call from a private investigator named Richard Donovan, hired by distant cousins of the Hartwell children, who had stumbled across Margaret's preliminary findings in a historical journal. "I've been digging through records that weren't meant to be found," Donovan explained, his voice low as they met in a quiet corner of the museum. He slid a worn leather folder across the table. The orphanage kept 2 sets of books, one for inspectors, another for internal use. Margaret's fingers trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were meticulously documented records of special sessions with selected children. Sister Agnes Byrne, a junior nun who had served directly under Sister Catherine McMahon, had maintained these secret logs with chilling precision. Sister Agnes was responsible for preparing the children, Donovan continued. She'd select those who wouldn't be missed, children without visitors, those whose parents had fully relinquished rights. James Morrison studied the documents, his former detective instincts awakening. "These aren't just photo sessions," he observed, pointing to notations in the margins. "Look at these symbols. They match the ones on the plaque in the original photograph." The records revealed a pattern. Children would be prepared, photographed, and then listed as transferred within days. No destination facilities were ever named. Sister Agnes followed orders without question, Donovan explained. "From what I've gathered, she believed she was serving a higher purpose, cleansing the children of their inherent sin through what they called the final portrait." News of these discoveries rippled through Chicago's historical community, creating a schism that cut deep. The prestigious St. Catherine's Historical Society, which had funded the orphanage for decades, convened an emergency meeting. Half the members insisted on protecting the institution's legacy, citing its countless charitable works. "And we cannot tarnish a century of good with unproven accusations," argued Eleanor Blackwood, granddaughter of Dr. Edmund Blackwood, her voice sharp with defensive anger. Others, particularly younger members and those from Irish immigrant families, demanded full disclosure. "My grandmother whispered about missing children from St. Mary's," said Michael O'Connor, his face flushed. "We called them ghost stories to help us sleep at night." But they weren't stories at all. Margaret found herself at the center of this storm, watching as loyalties fractured along lines of faith, heritage, and power. Some parishioners stopped attending the historic St. Mary's Cathedral, while others doubled their donations in defiant support. "Truth has a cost," James reminded her, as they watched the community divide, "but silence costs more." Walter Harris had kept his silence for over 80 years. The aging man, now well into his 90s, sat in Margaret Walsh's living room, his weathered hands trembling around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. October winds rattled the windows as he finally spoke of what he'd witnessed as a 14-year-old stable boy at St. Mary's. "It was just past midnight," Walter began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was sleeping in the stables when I heard the wheels." His haunted eyes seemed to look beyond the present. Back to that moonlit night in 1901. Sister Agnes was directing 2 groundskeepers. They had 3 wheelbarrows. Margaret leaned forward, recording every word while James Morrison took notes. The former detective recognized the unmistakable cadence of repressed trauma finally breaking free. "The wheelbarrows weren't carrying soil or supplies," Walter continued, his fingers tightening around the teacup. "They held small forms wrapped in white sheets. I can still feel the chill of that iron railing I gripped when I saw them pass." He described the mud-splattered wheels cutting tracks across the orphanage grounds, how one of the sheets had slipped just enough to reveal a small, pale hand. "It was so white, like marble," he said. "I recognized the copper bracelet. It belonged to little Elizabeth Hartwell." James exchanged a glance with Margaret. The Hartwell girl from the photograph, the one they'd been studying for months. "They took them to the far corner of the property," Walter said, "where the ground was soft near the creek. Sister Catherine supervised from a distance, holding a lantern. I heard her praying, but not the kind of prayers meant for comfort." The elderly man described how he'd hidden behind the stables, watching as the 3 small bodies were lowered into hastily dug graves. No markers, no ceremony, just dirt and silence. Walter's testimony provided what they'd been missing, eyewitness confirmation connecting the photograph's subtle horror to actual deaths. The stable boy had seen the aftermath of whatever had transpired in that photographer's studio. "I tried telling the groundskeeper the next day," Walter said, wiping a tear. "He threatened to throw me out on the street if I spoke another word. Where would an orphan boy go? So I buried it inside me. Same as they buried those children." Margaret reached for his hand. "You're giving them a voice now, Mr. Harris. After all these years," the old man nodded slowly, "I see their faces every night before I sleep. Thomas, Elizabeth, and William. Now maybe they can rest, and maybe so can I." The evidence mounted with each passing day. Margaret Walsh spread the documents across her desk, connecting threads between them like a detective mapping a crime scene. Forged birth certificates, meticulously altered death records that listed natural causes for dozens of children, and most damning of all, coded correspondence between Sister Catherine McMahon and Sister Agnes Byrne, using religious terminology to mask discussions of problem children who had been delivered to God's embrace. "Look at this," Margaret whispered, pushing a yellowed ledger toward James Morrison. The orphanage reported 23 adoptions in March 1902, but the city records show only 7 children leaving St. Mary's that month. The curator leaned forward, his former detective instincts fully awakened. "And the others? Vanished? No death certificates, no adoption papers, just gone?" Their investigation had not gone unnoticed. First came the anonymous calls to the museum board, questioning Margaret's mental stability. Then James found his car tires slashed in the parking lot with a note tucked under the windshield wiper. "Some history deserves to stay buried." Margaret herself received an envelope containing a photograph of her house, taken that same day, with a single line, "Historians who dig too deep often fall into the holes they create." "We should take this to the police," James urged, his face taut with concern. Margaret shook her head. "With what evidence? Century-old crimes. They'll dismiss us as obsessed academics." She ran her fingers through her graying hair. "Besides, whoever's behind this has connections. I received a letter from the Historical Society yesterday. My research grant is under ear review." The threats only intensified their resolve. They worked in different locations each day, coffee shops, libraries, James's apartment, never establishing a pattern. The historian meticulously copied every document, storing duplicates in multiple secure locations. If something happened to either of them, the truth would survive. One evening, as they pored over hospital records from 1902, James noticed Margaret's hands trembling. "We could step back," he offered quietly, "just for a while." She looked up, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. "Those children had no choice, no voice. We do." She tapped the photograph of the Hartwell siblings that never left her side. "And every time I consider giving up, I look at their faces." The line between seeking justice and ensuring their own survival grew thinner by the day. Each document they uncovered, each connection they made between the orphanage, the church, and wealthy donors placed them in greater danger. Yet they pressed on, knowing that unseen hands, some belonging to descendants of those original conspirators, were working frantically to bury the truth once more. November's cold descended upon Chicago like a shroud, the biting wind whistling through the streets and sharpening every fear that had been building since Margaret Walsh first discovered the photograph. The retired historian knew that gathering evidence alone wouldn't be enough. They needed witnesses, people whose memories might fill the gaps between documents and photographs. Margaret organized a clandestine meeting at the local library, choosing a private reading room tucked away from curious eyes. James Morrison stood guard at the door, his experience as a former detective evident in his watchful gaze as he vetted each arrival. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. What we discuss tonight must remain between these walls until we're ready to act." The small gathering consisted primarily of elderly members of the Irish community, people whose parents and grandparents had lived in the shadow of St. Mary's Home for Children. Some had been children themselves when the Hartwell siblings' photograph was taken. Eileen O'Connor, now 87, spoke first. "My mother worked in the laundry there," she whispered. "She'd come home some nights unable to speak, just crying, said there were stains no soap could wash away." A man named Patrick Donovan nodded solemnly. "My uncle was a gravedigger at Holy Cross Cemetery. He told me about midnight burials, small coffins, no names, no prayers. The nuns would pay him extra to forget what he saw." As the stories flowed, Margaret carefully documented each testimony, while James sketched a timeline on the chalkboard. The pattern was unmistakable. Children who misbehaved or questioned authority would suddenly transfer to other institutions, only to vanish entirely from records. Sister Catherine wasn't working alone, an elderly woman named Mary Fitzgerald added, her arthritic hands clutching a rosary. There was money changing hands, wealthy families wanting to adopt only perfect children, sending back the difficult ones. The room grew thick with tension and shared grief. For decades, these stories had been whispered only behind closed doors, dismissed as rumors or the bitter complaints of those who'd fallen from the church's grace. "They silenced us with shame," Patrick said, pounding his fist on the table. "Made us believe speaking ill of the orphanage was speaking ill of God himself." By the meeting's end, the atmosphere had transformed. What began as fearful whispers had crystallized into something powerful, a collective resolve to break generations of silence. Margaret looked around the room, at faces now animated with purpose rather than fear. "This isn't just about the past," she told them. "It's about ensuring such things never happen again." For the first time since she'd discovered those haunting marks on the Hartwell children's necks, Margaret felt the weight of isolation lifting. The truth, so long buried, was finally finding its voice. The yellowed envelope sat on the table between Margaret Walsh and James Morrison, bearing the official seal of the Chicago Archdiocese. After weeks of careful negotiation and veiled threats of public exposure, an elderly archivist had finally granted them access to the restricted files from 1902. Inside was a handwritten letter from Father Patrick Donovan, once the spiritual advisor to St. Mary's Home for Children. "They write this with a heavy heart," the priest's spidery handwriting confessed. "What began as charity has become commerce. The agreement between Sister Catherine, the diocese, and the Blackwood Foundation ensures children are placed quickly with families of means, regardless of suitability." Margaret's fingers trembled as she read further. The letter detailed a pact of discretion that bound all parties to silence. Wealthy Chicago families, desperate for heirs but unwilling to wait through proper channels, paid handsomely to bypass scrutiny. The orphanage received generous donations. The church maintained its reputation for charitable works. "And what of the children who couldn't be placed?" James asked quietly, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. The historian's stomach turned as she read about unfortunate incidents requiring special documentation. Father Donovan had written of children with undesirable temperaments who were subjected to corrective measures before being photographed for potential adoptive parents. "This explains the marks," Margaret whispered. "They weren't just documenting adoptions, they were covering up deaths." The letter mentioned Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Hartwell specifically, Three siblings whose difficult adjustment had required permanent intervention before their photograph was taken. James paced the small research room. It's not just Sister Catherine or Dr. Blackwood. This conspiracy reaches into every corner of old Chicago. Judges who signed adoption papers, police who ignored missing children reports, photographers who asked no questions. Margaret carefully placed the letter back in its protective sleeve. The truth was more monstrous than she had imagined. No single villain had orchestrated this horror. It was woven into the very fabric of the city's elite, a tapestry of complicity stretching across decades. The Hartwell children were just three among dozens, she said, her voice hardening with resolve. This wasn't just about discipline gone wrong. It was systematic, a business model built on disposing of children who couldn't be sold. The historian gathered her notes. A cold determination replacing her shock. The web of power, faith and money that had protected these secrets for a century was about to be exposed, no matter how many powerful ghosts she would disturb. The public exhibition in December 1902 was a gamble Margaret Walsh couldn't afford to lose. After months of meticulous preparation, she stood at the entrance of the small gallery space the museum had reluctantly provided, watching as visitors filed in with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. The photographs, now enhanced and displayed on stark white walls, stared back at the crowd, smiling children, their innocence forever betrayed by a thin, dark line. James Morrison moved through the room, carefully observing reactions. He had risked his professional reputation to support this exhibition, calling in favors from colleagues who owed him from his detective days. Samuel Carter's technical analysis was prominently featured beside each photograph, clinical descriptions that transformed vague suspicions into horrifying certainty. The marks are consistent with post-mortem positioning, the retired photographic expert had written, his words now immortalized on placards that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. An elderly woman clutched her handkerchief, tears streaming down her wrinkled face as she recognized a child who had vanished from her neighborhood decades ago. Other old women wept openly, their shoulders shaking with grief long suppressed. Men who'd funded the orphanage looked away, shame burning in their eyes as the community finally saw what had been hidden for so long. "I donated to them for 20 years, whispered one grey-haired benefactor to his wife. "Uddi, how could I not have known?" In the center of the exhibition stood the original photograph of the Hartwell siblings. Margaret had placed it deliberately, forcing visitors to confront the smiling faces of Thomas, Elizabeth and William before they could exit. Dr. Anthony Turner's forensic analysis accompanied it, his diagrams mapping the telltale marks with scientific precision. Sister Agnes Byrne made a brief appearance, her face ashen as she hurried through the gallery. The junior nun avoided eye contact with everyone, especially the enlarged image of her own signature on the photography session logs. She slipped out before reporters could approach her. By evening, the exhibition had drawn 3 times the expected attendance. Chicago's most respected newspaper had sent a journalist who lingered for hours, taking careful notes. Margaret watched him closely, hope and fear battling within her chest. This was her moment of truth. Either the story would break open like a dam, or it would be buried again, deeper than before. "They can't silence all of us," James said quietly, joining her near the exit. "Not anymore." Margaret nodded, watching as visitors left transformed, carrying the weight of truth like a solemn responsibility. The exhibition wasn't just about exposing St. Mary's dark past. It was about ensuring such shadows could never again hide in plain sight. The Chicago Tribune ran the headline on a Tuesday, "St. Mary's Orphanage, a century of secrets exposed." Margaret Walsh watched as people gathered around newspaper stands, their faces shifting from disbelief to horror as they absorbed the truth about the Hartwell siblings and countless others. This small victory had come at tremendous cost. "Your position is temporarily suspended pending review," the Historical Society's chairman had informed her the previous afternoon, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "Several board members have expressed concerns about the sensationalist nature of your claims." Margaret nodded silently, knowing what remained unsaid. 3 major donors had withdrawn their annual pledges, citing irresponsible revisionism. The museum's operating budget had been slashed by 30%. Even the building's electricity had been reduced to cut costs, leaving the corridors dimly lit, like the very orphanage she'd exposed. "You've made powerful enemies," James Morrison warned over coffee at a diner 2 blocks from the museum. The former detective's instincts for danger remained sharp. "The diocese has hired a publicity firm. They're calling your evidence circumstantial." "Let them," she replied, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was a newly authenticated letter from Sister Agnes Byrne, detailing the preparation rituals before photography sessions. The truth doesn't need their permission. That evening, Margaret returned to her apartment to find her mailbox stuffed with letters, some supportive, others threatening. An elderly woman had recognized her grandfather in one of the photographs. A local priest questioned her faith. A university wanted to host a lecture. A lawyer suggested she cease and desist. She spread them across her kitchen table, organizing them methodically as she'd once arranged historical artifacts. Each response, whether hateful or grateful, confirmed that the children's stories were finally being heard. The phone rang. It was Samuel Carter, his voice crackling with excitement. "I've been contacted by 3 other historical societies," the photographic expert said. "They're reviewing their own orphanage collections. This is spreading, Margaret." Later, alone with her thoughts, she opened her laptop and stared again at the digitized image of Thomas, Elizabeth, and William Hartwell. Their eyes seemed to follow her, not with accusation, but with a strange sort of gratitude. For a century, they had been trapped in that moment, their suffering disguised as serenity. Every professional slight, every withdrawn donation, every whispered criticism, none of it mattered against the weight of those 3 small faces. Margaret touched the screen gently, her resolve hardening like amber around a truth too long buried. "I see you," she whispered to the children, "and now so does everyone else." As the weeks passed, Margaret's empathy became her armor. The weight of the investigation had taken its toll, threatening letters in her mailbox, whispered warnings at the museum, funding cuts that jeopardized her livelihood. Yet each morning she returned to her desk, driven by something deeper than professional curiosity. Margaret Walsh found herself staring at the photograph of the Hartwell children for hours, tracing their small faces with weathered fingers. In their eyes, she recognized the same silent plea she'd carried as a child after losing her parents to influenza, that unspoken language of the abandoned, the desperate hope that someone would notice, someone would care. "They had no one," she whispered to James during one of their late-night research sessions. "Just like I didn't," the former detective nodded, understanding that for Margaret this had become personal. Her own childhood photographs, sparse and solemn, sat in a drawer at home, echoing with similar silences. Her apartment had transformed into an investigative hub, walls covered with timeline charts, string connecting events, and enlarged sections of the orphanage photograph. The skills she'd developed through years of amateur photography proved invaluable. Where others saw shadows, Margaret detected deliberate obfuscation. Where casual observers noticed blurry backgrounds, she identified concealed evidence. "Your eye for detail is extraordinary," Samuel Carter had told her. after she spotted a reflection in a window glass that revealed another photographer present during the children's final portrait. You see what was meant to remain invisible. Each night, Margaret meticulously documented her findings, creating backup copies she stored in different locations. She'd learned that evidence had a way of disappearing when powerful institutions felt threatened. Her notebooks filled with observations, the slight discoloration around Elizabeth Hartwell's wrist suggesting restraint, the unnatural angle of Thomas's shoulders indicating posing after death. Some nights, the burden became almost unbearable. She'd wake gasping from dreams where the children called to her, their voices thin and distant. On those nights, Margaret would brew tea in her kitchen, staring out at Chicago's glittering skyline, so different from the city the Hartwell siblings had known. "I won't let them silence you again," she promised the empty air. "Every detail matters. Every omission is a crime." Her meticulous nature, once considered merely a professional asset, had become her greatest weapon against institutional forgetting. Where documents had been altered, Margaret found the inconsistencies. Where testimonies contradicted, she uncovered the truth beneath carefully constructed lies. The Hartwell siblings had become more than subjects of investigation. They were her silent partners, guiding her through a century of deliberate forgetting toward a justice long overdue. James Morrison found a profound sense of purpose in the investigation that had consumed their lives for months. The former police detective turned curator had spent years trying to forget the cases he'd failed to solve, the victims whose justice had slipped through his fingers. This time would be different. As he meticulously organized the evidence they'd gathered, the photographs, the diary entries, the testimonies, James felt he was finally making amends for past failures. "Sometimes the dead speak louder than the living," he told Margaret one evening as they worked late in the museum archives. "I spent 20 years chasing criminals who were still breathing, but these children," he gestured toward the Hartwell siblings. "Photograph. They've been waiting a century for someone to listen." Samuel Carter, meanwhile, was experiencing an unexpected renaissance in his career. The aging photographic expert had been largely forgotten by academia until his groundbreaking analysis of the St. Mary's photographs. Now, his phone rang constantly with requests for interviews and consulting work. Universities that had once dismissed his methods now cited him in scholarly journals. At 78, Carter found himself vindicated. His lifelong dedication to photographic forensics finally recognized. "It's not about the recognition," he insisted when Margaret thanked him for his contributions. "It's about setting the historical record straight. Those children deserved better than to be props in someone else's performance of charity." For Walter Harris, the unburdening came differently. After decades of carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed as a stable boy, the wheelbarrows moving through the night, the small forms beneath shrouds, the elderly man found a peace he hadn't known since childhood. His testimony had broken open the case, giving substance to what had previously been only suspicion. "And I can sleep now," he confided to James during a follow-up interview. "For the first time in 60 years, I don't see their faces when I close my eyes." Even Sister Catherine McMahon seemed transformed by the unfolding revelations. Margaret spotted her one Sunday morning in the chapel, her once commanding presence diminished to a hunched figure in the back pew. The nun's hands trembled not just with age, but with the weight of exposed secrets. As worshippers filed past, few acknowledged her, the community's silent verdict already passed. "She knows," James observed quietly. "Whatever stories she told herself all these years, whatever justification she clung to, they're crumbling now." The investigation had changed them all, binding them together in ways none could have anticipated. Each person involved had found their own form of resolution in the truth they'd unearthed. The exhibition hall fell silent as the last visitor departed. leaving only the echo of footsteps against polished floors. Margaret Walsh stood alone in the dimly lit gallery, her reflection ghosting across the glass that protected the Hartwell siblings. Photograph. The image that had once been merely a curious artifact now represented something far more profound, a testament to voices silenced too soon. Thomas, Elizabeth, and William stared back at her with those eerily serene smiles. The retired historian reached out, her fingertips hovering inches from the glass, tracing the outline of those faint dark marks that had started everything. These children were no longer anonymous faces lost to time. They had become symbols of institutional betrayal, their story now impossible to ignore. They deserved better, she whispered to the empty room. The exhibition had accomplished what Margaret had hoped. Over 500 visitors had seen the evidence, read the testimonies, and confronted the uncomfortable truth about St. Mary's. The orphanage's carefully constructed facade of benevolence had crumbled beneath the weight of Walter's testimony, Samuel's analysis, and the damning priest's letter detailing the pact of discretion. She thought of James Morrison, who had stood beside her through threats and professional ostracism. The former detective had found a measure of peace in this investigation, his police instincts vindicated after all these years. Dr. Turner's forensic confirmation had silenced even the most ardent defenders of the establishment. Margaret gathered her notes, feeling the weight of responsibility lifting slightly from her shoulders. The community had finally acknowledged what happened within those orphanage walls. Even some of the wealthy benefactors who had initially tried to discredit her findings had eventually bowed their heads in shame. She remembered Sister Catherine's face at the chapel weeks earlier, how the elderly nun's hands had trembled as she lit candles, perhaps seeking absolution that would never come. The system that had protected her and Sister Agnes had finally failed, exposing decades of calculated cruelty disguised as discipline. As Margaret switched off the gallery lights, she knew this was not an ending, but a beginning. Other institutions would be scrutinized, other photographs examined with newfound suspicion. The Hartwell siblings had unwittingly become sentinels against future abuses, their frozen smiles a warning that appearances often conceal terrible truths. The story of St. Mary's would no longer be celebrated in historical texts as a beacon of charity. Instead, it would serve as a reminder that history itself is often complicit in burying inconvenient truths, that behind every carefully composed image might lurk stories too dark to face without courage. Margaret took one last look at the children's faces. "Rest now," she whispered. "You've been heard."